First, I think I want to talk about the passage from Corinthians. Paul's letter is trying to establish the spiritual nature of being, especially in reference to the resurrection and the anticipated second coming of Christ. There was a sense that Christ was going to return imminently, and that event would involve the salvation of all people who believe, and that they would be taken up to God. Embracing the resurrection of Christ and the nature of this sort of apocalyptic event yet to come is central to what Paul is trying to teach the people. It answers the question of what is all this for, and attempts to provide hope for a church that was up against its share of infighting and outside pressure. Many chapters of the epistles involve Paul trying to tease out some of the specifics, and you can see his ideas changing depending on when they were written. The Gentile Greeks of Corinth, for example, do not have a secure cultural reference for resurrection, and they seem to have specific concerns about those who may have died before Christ returns. If we're going to heaven, what about the people who aren't here anymore? This was the reason that the recipients of the letter needed to be assured about the spiritual aspect of themselves, something separate from the body which could die. Paul helpfully describes the spiritual self as being intrinsically related to the physical form that they could observe, equally God-given, but more glorious in its ability to transcend mortal sin and burden. So therefore, they don't have to worry about the people who have died. The important part of that stage of history would be intact for the proper time, that spiritual self. The physical body is significant, but it's ultimately inconsequential in the face of the existence of this spiritual body, and this spiritual body's significance to Christian humanity's ultimate destiny. Then we come to this particular gospel reading, in which Jesus seems to say that in response to violence, we should be willing to accept additional violence. When our resources are asked for or taken, we should part with an even greater amount. Now, this isn't to say that nonviolence and generosity are not good positions to hold. I think both of those are favorable ones, actually. But the degree and the situations that are described here are a little extreme. The physical safety and security of the person in question is being opened up. Though I should note that there is nothing specifically linking the passage from Corinthians and this passage from Luke, other than that the lectionary pairs the two together. Their words line up with this idea of the body being unimportant. And doing things that can put it at risk are good, actually, because they have spiritual value at the expense of your physical needs or integrity. Sure, one might argue that this doesn't say that you're giving away your only coat, or that the coat isn't just a metaphor for some luxury item that one does not absolutely need. I think the implication of these phrases is clear because of the turn the other cheek instruction that precedes it. When your instinct says that enough has been done, it seems to say that you should allow yourself to go further. What follows is the point of the passage. Doing things like this will mean that you will get into heaven, or receive greater rewards in heaven at least. It's foregoing the body in order to benefit the spirit, an echo of what Paul would later try to explain to new Christians a number of decades after this teaching would have been uttered, and a few centuries before they would actually be written down in this gospel. The dating is complicated, because a lot of this in context is a pretty violent world. Paul is writing to a church that had martyrs of their own in Greece. Jesus also tells us that there is going to be violence as part of being a Christian. In passages elsewhere in this gospel, we are told that doing this ministry will result in persecution. So much imagery is taken up in there being a physical cost to salvation. But to what degree are we meant to endure things or invite further difficulty into our lives? Are we to understand that bearing suffering is somehow spiritually cleansing, since we should be inviting it into our lives? Are there consequences to this martyrdom? Christian martyrdom is a significant part of Christian history, even if today it's much less commonplace. The image of the martyr does feel like a bit of a fulfillment of what Jesus has promised. Martyrdom was seen as a brave death with redemptive consequences, and it seems like this will be the favor of the Most High that Jesus references in this gospel. But as I said, it is very much of its time. This was a tradition of spectacular death that came out of a Greek and Roman culture, overlaid with Greek ideals of witnessing to truth. And from that all was birthed this idea of the martyr, which was perfectly formed to participate in the persecution of early Christians. Here, violence was seen as inevitable but ultimately good, informed by the teachings of early Christians, some of which would be the ultimate second class of the physical body and the desire to achieve virtue by whatever means available in order to secure the grace of God in anticipation of the rapidly approaching second coming. Which is a lot of pressure, to be fair. But early Christians loved these accounts, and reading accounts of martyrs often felt like it was accessing this area of grace that was inaccessible to those who still lived. We do need to keep in mind that this was the age of the gladiator and the arena, and there was a sense that death and persecution and ending up being martyred was a real possibility for Christians who were committed to practicing their faith. From our unpersecuted perspective a couple of millennia later, with our theology informed more by our time, we are not attuned so much to what this might have meant for them. It is difficult for us to understand death in itself as being righteous, or to cast suffering as something that should simply be accepted. Except sometimes we, Christians, do. Though it doesn't take on the form of martyrdom, there is a sense that violence and suffering can be justified if it happens in a certain context. If we are Christians that believe that there is good and there is evil, and that God is inevitably on the side of good, we have to make some justifications for why there is suffering, and that can take many forms, some of which I have preached about in the past, and others I might try to discuss in the future. But this kind of theology can be taken in a violence-accepting direction. For Christians who are perhaps more fundamentalists, they may see terrorist attacks or natural disasters of this century as being either acts of evil perpetrated by Satan or a nudge from God, reminding nations that they need to be of more service to the forces of good. Similar attacks on enemies, though, is seen as justified, as they did bad things, therefore God is punishing them. But we still see that our actions have a direct effect on the state of our spiritual selves, and that this will impact our state with God, at least in the way that this passage and others like it are interpreted in their totality. So why are we talking about this? Why does it matter for us in the United Church, where I think it's safe to say that many of us don't think about God quite that way, or would choose to focus more intently on other parts of this passage? I think it's important and necessary to look at some of these darker implications of our scriptures, as well as the history of our religion and the other sects that hold power in our time. Building our faith in a responsible way means being aware of how other people think about the same texts that we use on a weekly basis. Because as Christians who believe in equitable justice and the humanity and dignity of all people, and the right for people to be free from abuse, violence, or oppression, we stand in a unique position to be able to speak out against Christians who do not believe in these things. People who may romanticize someone's abuse or suffering, or look down on people in poverty as deserving it because they did a sin or they didn't believe in Christian God enough. The problem with this gospel reading is not that Jesus is saying that we should glorify suffering, but that it can be taken to mean that based on the political or social goals that the interpreter happens to have. But this also means that if you or I go in to read and interpret these passages, we have the same power to come to different conclusions that support the things that we believe in. To begin this process, I want to start with this line: "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." This line comes at the end of the rationale as to why we should love our enemies and do some of these other, perhaps counterintuitive things. They allow us to be reflective of God, and that is the highest order of righteousness, and that our spiritual being can take. Assurance that the measure of our worthiness will be full, if you believe in such things. But I think that this idea of mercy is important, because that's the thing I feel is lacking in the perceptions of Christianity that glorify or accept violence or suffering. Who deserves mercy? If we accept that this mercy is important as nonviolence or generosity that can allow us to go down this path of allowing suffering, I feel like it forces us to read those passages in a different way. It means we have to read these instructions not as prescriptive commands that must be followed in all circumstances, but pieces of a larger whole that pursues a kind of equitable justice. If giving away your coat would harm you, does that show mercy? If you do not have the power to endure violence done against you, does continuing to endure it show mercy? If we pray for our enemies without holding them to account for what they are doing to others, does that show mercy? In certain situations, it does not. So instead, we must humble ourselves. We must remember that there are instances where we will not have the power or endurance or wealth to endure the way that Jesus is asking us to endure. Our bodies will not allow for it. These bodies that are still important because they're not going to be rapidly disposed of next week when Christ returns to the earth. Instead, these are vessels by which we do all of the good things that the world requires, to seek justice and resist evil, and to show mercy to ourselves and others in their own bodily suffering and spiritual suffering. Perhaps the most important part of this passage is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This golden rule is one of those unifying forces that's easy to understand and is helpful in living an ethical way. It also does a good job of reframing these other pieces that have come before us, like the cheek, the shirt, and the rest of it. This is not a prescriptive way to live an ethical, nonviolent, empty existence, but is instead pointing us towards living in an equitable and generous world, where everyone has what they need. This, I do not believe, is a world where any suffering is justifiable, and that it should be stopped if it can be prevented. It is a world in which we can aim for reducing the number of enemies that we have to pray for, not by hoping for their destruction, but by building bridges and changing hearts towards the larger project that Jesus saw for us. The point of this passage is not that Christ is coming and that believers should prepare themselves for the end by seeking to save themselves, but rather that this world needs people to tend to it by promoting peace and mutual aid. These themes of apocalypse are present in our scriptures, and we should figure out how to reconcile that for ourselves. What is this event or process going to look like, and how will the teachings of Christ factor into it? Perhaps that's a topic for another time. But at the end of this whole thing, we have to remember our scriptures are our responsibilities, as are the theologies that they produce. Advocate for what you believe in, and what you feel like you are being asked to do. If that is sacrificing your earthly body, decide for yourself what exactly that means. How you live into your faith and what values you seek to affect is always through your choice. For as Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Amen.